Why the Royalists Lost the English Civil War Part 2. In the last video, when I was talking about why the Royalists lost the English Civil War, there was a couple comments that brought up a very interesting point, and that was that the Royalists were generally pretty undisciplined. So I'm going to add a bit to those comments, and then maybe a little bit of a counterpoint. So the accusation that the Royalists were an undisciplined force is largely founded in reality. In the early years, the Royalists were very prone to looting the cities that they captured. For example, see the first siege of Bristol. While the Royalists were able to use arms and money from the city to largely re-equip, they had large numbers of desertions and people just going home with their stolen goods. Now, where does this come from? Well, yesterday we alluded to the idea that the Royalists had served all over Europe, and the wars they had served in was the War of Spanish Succession and the 30 Years' War. And in these wars, if you know anything about them, it was the first time that Europe had really seen massed armies rolling across the continent. And here we see a problem, because you can't have a large army without a large amount of food and a large amount of money. This was especially true considering these wars had very, very high numbers of what we would call today mercenaries. So often the way that the wars proceeded was that an army would be constantly on the move and constantly feeding and funding itself through looting. It would meet another army and it would inevitably clash. Afterwards, this was drawn back and basically European war changed forever because of this, but the English Civil War was not an exception. When the Royalists were fighting the Parliamentarians, they fought them in the same way they had fought in Europe. Often a charge levied against Prince Rupert, probably the Royalists' best cavalry commander, is that he was rash and a cavalier, and he only really cared about looting. But of course, it's important to provide the alternate viewpoint that this was the only method of warfare in which he was trained, and on the flip side, it was the only real method of warfare that the Parliamentarians were trained in. Of course, yesterday I alluded to the fact that many Parliamentarians had served in these same wars, and they brought back many of the same tactics. Both sides were bogged down with desertion, looting, and just general mayhem. The Royalists just suffered it a lot more.